I get pretty jaded about religion. I get pretty jaded about the state of American Christianity right now. There's so much in our faith tradition, in our texts, that emphasize the need to care for others, to prioritize the need of others over ourselves. Not in opposition of ourselves, but instead of living out of just simple greed and self-interest. And so I'm pretty jaded right now when it comes to religiosity. I'm pretty jaded when it comes to so many of our super corporatized churches. Pretty jaded about our religious leaders who have embraced greed, embraced self-interest, embraced leveling themselves up and their churches up at the cost of their neighbors and at the cost of their integrity. But I'm not too jaded by Jesus. I'm not jaded by God. In fact, I find myself continuously compelled and challenged, in spite of the religiosity that has the center stage right now, by what I see of Jesus and the early church in our New Testament. It doesn't mean I love everything in the New Testament. As you know, there's some stuff that just really rubs me wrong. And we keep going through the book of Acts, and I mentioned this before, I'll mention it again. We're almost done with it at this point. We're getting real close. But this is a hagiography, which is a real fancy way of saying, kind of an idealized biography or an idealized history. Well, what that means is the values represented in the book of Acts are the values that this writer and their communities wanted to live into the most. So when we're reading about an increasingly diverse church, an increasingly inclusive church, an increasingly equitable church, they're simplifying some of the struggles for that, and it's not necessarily uniformly true, but as far as the book of Acts is concerned, as far as its writer is concerned, this is what the church is supposed to be about. This is what Jesus would have wanted the church to be about. And this is in the midst of colonization, in the midst of a Roman Empire that dominated everyone, dominated Jewish people in Jerusalem and abroad, dominated other Romans. We forget that part, that if you're in the Roman Empire, you are still in subjugation. You may have various levels of privilege, but you're still in a tyrannical, oppressive government. Rome has its Caesar, and Caesar is the Son of God in that world. Caesar is the divine representative of the heavens. And this is some of the trouble that Jesus gets into and the early church gets into. At this point in our book, Paul has now been arrested. And now, that was last week, this week, he's been transferred over to Caesarea, which is kind of the closest stronghold of the Roman government. This is where the governor lives. So he's been transferred over to the governor's private jail. And there he is sitting, waiting his day in court for the governor to say whether or not he's innocent and can be freed or not. And so the governor, Felix, he calls Paul out, he listens to his case. Paul's opponents, the Jewish folks who saw him in the temple, they present their side of the case. Their point is basically like, hey, we have these three things that Paul did, and he deserves his comeuppance. He profanes the temple by bringing in a Gentile, someone who's not Jewish. He has blasphemed against our religion, spoken against the Jewish religion in general. And the last one, he instigated a riot. Now, out of those three things, Felix cares the most, primarily, about the latter. Because the way you keep a government as big as Rome running is by keeping a tight control on uprisings. You don't want people speaking out. You don't want riots, right? And so, he listens to Paul, and Paul basically, he's like, look, I didn't bring a Gentile into the temple, and you can't prove that I did. And I've not spoken against our religion. In fact, that's still my religion, guys. I'm Jewish, and I follow Jesus. And I'm not speaking against it. This is still a hard thing for many of us to wrap our brains around today. But back during this time period, Jewish people and Christians had so much in common that they still debated whether or not Christians were Jewish. Right? And then the last point, he's basically like, y'all can't prove that I instigated that riot, and you know it. And Felix is rather compelled by all of this, but he says, I need more time to figure out the facts of the case. So he sends Paul back to his jail cell, and then him and his wife, they get bored. They want to be entertained a little bit, and they figure, we got this interesting guy just down there in the cellar. Let's bring him up. I want to hear more about this whole Jesus thing. He calls him up, and he starts sharing, and they like what he's got to say. Until he gets to stuff like justice and treat people fairly. And then he talks about divine accountability, and that really disturbs Felix. He's like, nah, I don't like that. Don't like that at all. Back to the jail. And that is where Paul remains for 2 more years. Felix knows that he's innocent. He's relatively convinced of it. He's been entertained and disturbed by Paul. But he wants a little bit more out of Paul. He knows that Paul gathered a pretty big offering to bring to the Jewish church, the Jerusalem-centered church, because of a famine that they were experiencing. And he wants some of that famine money, So he's trying to extort Paul. Surely he can squeeze some money out of Paul or the community. Turns out, Felix ends up leaving before Paul does. He ends up getting replaced by Festus, which is such a great name. There's just not enough kids named Festus running around, right? And Festus isn't noted for having the same greed as Felix, but he does deeply value, like all effective Roman governors, those politics of control. You don't get the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, without having a vice grip on your citizens and on the folks that you've subjugated. But when you've got to bust out your war horse, that's a frustrating thing for any governor to have to deal with. So he prefers to collude with the leaders in Jerusalem. So he brings them all out again, and he hears the case again, and Paul makes a pretty good point again. But he wants to send Paul into their custody over in Jerusalem. And this is a pretty dangerous thing. They've already been noted by this point to have a conspiracy to kill Paul So Paul doesn't love this idea either. So he uses his right as a citizen to appeal to a higher authority, not God, but to the court of Caesar. And then Festus is like, fine. And like every good student who has to write a report, he invites his friend over to help him figure out how to do it. He brings over Herod Agrippa II. Now, Herod Agrippa I died earlier after having killed one of the apostles. So this is kind of a bloody lineage to be a part of. It's a very interesting story in the Book of Acts. The Book of Acts gets wild sometimes, guys. I've skipped over some of like the demon possession stuff, and it's too bad because it's like, it's like horror flick demon possession. It's good. I've also skipped over like Herod Agrippa's wormy death. I know, right? Yeah. Go back and read this crazy book. I know. I have to pick and choose. We've only been spending 6 months in this book, you know? Yeah, just about. So Herod Agrippa II comes. And apparently, him and Festus are really hitting it off. They're having a grand old time with each other. Herod is king of the Jews. That's his title. Festus is the governor. The way this operates is that Herod kind of has a at the will of the Caesar monarchy. So he needs to be like in good terms with Festus to be effective. But luckily they like each other. And they have Paul over, they bring him back out, they have a little dinner and a movie, they listen to Paul tell his story, and that's when some really great one-liners like we had a moment ago up on the screen come out. This is where Festus is like, Paul, your great learning has driven you mad, which is so good. That's such a good line. There's so many times in seminary I was like, I feel that in my bones. My great learning is driving me crazy. And then Paul basically is like, look, I'm not talking to you, Festus. I'm talking to King Herod Agrippa II. Because he knows all about this. He knows what his dad was up to. He knows what Jesus was up to. I'm talking about that. I'm sharing my truth about that. And Herod bristles. And he says, do you seek for me to become a Christian so quickly? And the term Christian is, well, it's an insult at this point. It's a pejorative statement. And Paul says, whether short or long, I would love for you and everyone else to be just like me, except for these chains. And it's interesting at this point that he's chosen to preach his truth, how he perceives Jesus, the revealing of Jesus. He keeps calling Jesus the light, the illuminator, the enlightener, you can think of it as. He's choosing that battle instead of trying to make a case for himself on why he should be freed. Here he is in this dangerous ground, speaking to the most powerful people he's ever spoken to before, with the ability, perhaps, to go home. And he chooses to speak a different message. And he's not speaking out of self-interest. He's not speaking out of seeming pragmatism. He's not trying to control a situation. He's not speaking out of greed. All that he's saying is in direct opposition of these two gentlemen, that he carries this hope could be changed. He speaks of how he hopes they can repent, turn from their ways, and pick God. This passage challenges me because it reminds me that even the most oppressive in our society can change. We've seen people in powerful seats of government and corporatocracy and churches change. We can have hope that our society can change, that American Christianity perhaps could change. Maybe it will, but not if we abdicate our role, not if we give up our pulpits to these folks with the louder voices, the bigger churches. I need that reminder because, like I said at the beginning, I get pretty jaded. I can feel pretty cynical sometimes. And I was one of those people once upon a time as well. And I changed. Let's not give up hope on one another. Let's not give up hope on our friends and our family members out there. And let's not abdicate our own prophetic voices, our own opportunities, when we get to speak a truth in defiance of greed, self-interest, seeming pragmatism. We could do two things at the same time. We could be people of integrity and people of hope at the same time. And so as we get ready to see loved ones this Thanksgiving week, I'm not saying you need to go and argue, pick your battles. You got to come out of the Thanksgiving week with your whole self intact too. But don't give up. Don't give up on people. The only way we get through this crazy moment we're in is together.